In a minute. Think about it to yourself. If you want to write something to actually go ahead, and then we'll share with the person next to us and then share lots of thoughts. The first question is, can we get to liberation without getting to equity first? Why or why not? The second is, what do we need in order to create a more equitable system? Specifically, the system that we're talking about is education. Okay, take about 30 seconds and then we'll get there.
Can you frame the question to, like, are we talking specifically, if are we thinking like education as a whole, like where do you want our answers to like be focused on question 2?
I'll let you decide that.
Okay.
30 seconds. Okay, go ahead and turn and talk to the person next to you about what you're thinking through. And that's okay, you don't have to have answers, right? Just think through talk through what you're thinking about. Okay, go ahead and bring it back. Okay. Would anyone like to highlight anything that came up in conversations with their partners? It's okay if you know. Yeah.
Jen pissed me off back here.
By the way, nothing new in our relationship.
And she asked a really good question. She's like, because I said that you needed to understand equity before you could get to liberation. And she said, from like a bigger scale, if we never thought equity was going to happen, like, do we just throw our hands up and say like liberation's even completely off the table? And they're like, that was frustrating.
Was it frustrating in the sense that
my sense of optimism disappeared.
okay.
They're like, I thought maybe so, but then like, if there are people who think we can't even get to equity, then like, what are we even trying to get to? Like, why another stage if we can't even get to like the middle stage?
Yeah. Other thoughts, reactions? Yes, Doris.
We were talking about like what the difference between liberation and equity is, and saying that like if equity is just being like equal within the system, and liberation is like breaking the system, then you probably don't need. But that's what we were talking about. Do we? Yeah. But that was how we were figuring out our conversation. I don't know if we got to the answer of what we felt.
Russell?
Yeah, similar to that, we were talking about how here we are preparing our kids to be successful within the system and then hopefully to go out and change the system. We're not teaching them to go out with pitchforks and torches and destroy it. We're teaching them to win the game and then hopefully change the game. But we're not, but like we're focused on ACT, we're focused on college readiness, we're focused, our goals for them are very within the system.
Right. But I like that second piece that you added in terms, even though they're within the system, we still want to push them in terms of challenging, right, and then changing the system as well in order to fit their needs. Carlo?
Yeah, also I think the process of obtaining equity requires like a certain level of awareness of it. And so I'm following with this metaphor, right? Like even these three figures here are going to be aware of inequity in other people's needs so that when that fence gets kicked down, they're not just like tackling each other to get the better viewpoint. The like taller kid isn't just like throwing the little kids down the hill so he has more space, but he's like a little more aware. So I think that made more sense the first time I read it. You have to learn and adopt the mindset of equity before you can actually like function in a liberated state.
Grant, right, who is the assistant principal over at KDMS, wants to share something.
Hey guys, I want to pose a question. Alright, so are there things that we do that could also, like, when you talk about the wall, right? What is the wall, right? And if we're looking at that liberation piece, what are the things that contribute to that wall? Or I want to get more perceptions around that last piece.
I think about like our kids and like how poverty kind of affects like your day to day, right? I think it's easy for us to say, oh, delay gratification, delay these types of things, like don't go to work now, like hold off, like invest in your education, know it's going to pay off both in the end, in 4 years, 6 years, however many years until you graduate. But like for them, you know, it's easy for me to say that as someone who's not necessarily struggling financially where I can't afford to ensure that I have dinner on the table for myself each night, right? When literally that's the struggle each day, right? And so you have those barriers of like immediate economic needs that get in the way of long-term goal setting and long-term performance in a lot of ways. That's where I see the fence in some ways, based on our students' context.
1, 2, 3. And then we're probably going to cut it off there just because we have a lot to get through today.
Yeah, I think like when we were doing the reading, the idea of passive racism stands to me as a wall. As long as like we are passively racist, that is like preventing people from achieving liberation.
And like I also feel like some of it is societal perceptions. Like when people say, "Oh, there's always going to be poor people," or "We're always going to have racism." Like the idea that we can't get past the fact that we can change, and like it needs to be a constant project rather than this belief that, oh well, you can't get rid of poverty. Like the belief that you can get us to that other part.
Yeah, it's also interesting because even though this is here, there are still other people who are building up the fence simultaneously as you try to knock it down, right? And so thinking about that as an analogy also. Kaplan?
I think in terms of education, the wall is like standardized testing that everyone has to do, and we do a great job with equity here, like making them our North Stars and giving our students a fighting chance to be able to see over that wall and use them. And the liberation piece is tough because that's an area in education where so much money is allocated to those tests, and like keeping them as like a thing that's needed in education to have all these like tests that are uniform across like at a national level. So it's crazy in education, but like the amount of money that's circled around that's insane, and we do a good job trying to give them a chance to stand on some boxes to like that equity piece. But yeah, that's what I kind of see.
Thank you. Appreciate y'all engaging in that conversation. So moving forward, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share some feedback that Jess and I got from the past sessions and how we're responding to it. So the top is the feedback, the green box is the response to it. So the demo was very enlightening, more small group discussions, doing some of this in smaller groups in order to hear more voices. I think that we are having the same voices repeatedly share out, and we need to solicit all opinions. So one thing that in responding, right, sessions are over 2 PD sessions, and so instead of being 1 hour, they are 2 hours, so more time, hopefully more voice, more conversation. Today's session involves a lot of smaller group work in order for us to hear more voices within that. And also I'm asking to remind us to move up into the conversation if we feel like our voices aren't being heard, and also move back if we feel like we're dominating the conversation, so just being very self-aware about that. The second, so push for one concrete actionable step, personal or group-oriented per session. I'm frustrated, or let me go one by one actually. So for this first one, we're going to provide space within each section for reflection so you can decide what your own personal steps are going to be. A lot of times those are going to be personal and individual, and sometimes we'll provide group next steps, but just so you know that we are going to provide space for that. The second, I'm frustrated. I feel like we've allowed people to walk away with this idea that individual actions with students is a way to change systemic and institutional oppression, asked to move from individual introspection to actual institutional change. So I think one thing that I was thinking through as I was thinking about that, systems are inherited to people, but people at the same time uphold the system that is inherited to us and perpetuate the oppression involved within the system. And so what we need to do is that if the system changes but the people don't, then what we're doing is we're still allowing that oppression to perpetuate itself even within a changed system, if that makes sense. And so what we need to do, I think, is start at the individual level before we necessarily analyze the institutional level, right? But we are going to try to be better at analyzing some of that institutional level change that needs to happen, especially for those who think they're ready, through some working groups that we're going to talk about in a minute. And then the last one says, I think we should commit to using this to address systems in our school year, which goes with the working group that I'm going to talk about. I'm at the beginning of this work. Introspection is an intense but healthy process. I'm leaving the session with an awareness of my own psychosocialization and what I can do to make sure I'm not perpetuating the negative messages that can sometimes be unconscious. I appreciate the discussions of vulnerability. I feel empowered and disheartened. And so just to acknowledge that we are all at different places, right? And let's make sure that we are appreciating and respecting and also being there for the teammates who are at different places in order to truly help ourselves, lift ourselves up in order to do this work. And then also just to mention that, and I tell this to my class all the time, social justice work is also, it can be very disheartening, can be very heartbreaking, but at the same time, our goal is to not stay there, right? Our goal is to kind of create hope and to create, in order for that hope to change into action, right? And to actionable steps so we can create change. Okay? And so looking ahead, just so you know, there's going to be a survey coming out that Justin and I are going to provide some dates that we have available. For 2 groups. The first working group is going to be a CRP working group, and this is related to curriculum and instruction in terms of if you feel like you want to sit down and look at a unit, a lesson plan specifically, and talk about how can I make this more culturally relevant, right? How can I make my instruction so, right? We can help you and discuss those strategies. And the second thing is like a system analysis working group in terms of like, okay, let's create that space in order to talk about the systems that are in play at our school and see how we can challenge and change them. Okay, and so just be on the lookout for that. Questions about any of this? Cool. And then finally for this, we're going to try to adapt and personalize the time that we have here today and hopefully make it as effective, as efficient as possible because we do have a lot to get through.
Okay, so this brings us to our agenda and our aims for today. Can I have Bakes read our first aim and then Gigi will read our second? We will be able to norm on language that leads itself to race and gender.
We will be able to engage in courageous conversations based on race.
And so, take a second to glance to the agenda. Today really is about kind of getting like high level so that we can then get into the nitty gritty next week. And we have kind of split that the session across like 2 specific PDs to allow for the time for more voices and more discussion in small groups during this session. And so you're going to see a lot of, I would just say like small group time to really process like the readings about like what is institutional racism. What are some of these terms that we throw around? Because like the other thing that's important is like if I'm using the word race and Sal is using the word race and we're using them in different contexts and with different understandings, like then it's hard to communicate, and that's going to be really important next week because we are going to move into some crucial conversations using scenarios that have actually come up in KIPP, Colorado, and thinking through like how would we partner, how would we have those conversations, and those terms will likely come up in those conversations. Cool. As a last note today, we have
have provided space, we are gonna provide space today for the TNTP survey within the end of today's PD. And so we will pivot to that at the end. I know that's kind of like a little, it's definitely a pivot, right? Just didn't need it. But we wanted to make sure you guys had time for that in the actual PD session. And so one thing I just wanted to step back, these are some questions that we got in the feedback from last time, and people were asking me like, what is CRP, and like what, like when are we gonna start to get to that? When are we gonna start to talk about like impact on curriculum? And so a couple things just to kind of frame this. One is the delineation between our DEIL sessions and CRP. So there's a lot of cool structures that are being rolled out at the regional level that are definitely still, I would say, like, there, Anthony Grant was really, first off, snaps to Anthony Grant, like he's leading a lot of things to help us be, I think, meta about the work we're doing, right? So like as we're looking at like, how do we give action steps as coaches and GBF, like we're also thinking about like, what does that look like with the DEIL lens? And that's just like one small example, but that is like very much in the works right now, and school leaders are getting trained on that. And so school leaders are really owning kind of the rollout of like, what does CRP coaching look like? This is also like an intense passion of mine. I love talking about this stuff and would love to like nerd out with you guys about this as well. So like we'll be talking about that in the working group as well. So that'll be another avenue to get it on the books a little bit sooner than having to kind of like wait for all of that to come to full fruition, if that makes sense. And then DEIL, just like I think like in full transparency, like we're learning too, and like I definitely don't have all the answers, and so like we are partners in this work, and so as we uncover things that may be true or untrue about the context that we live in, work in, operate in, we definitely want to be partners in that thought. And so in that vein, has anybody ever seen the scenario of the escalator, or what do we call this? It's at the airport? Moving sidewalk. Sal and I spent like 5 minutes trying to figure out we were like, I don't know what I called it. Anyway, has anybody ever seen that analogy before when it comes to kind of systems of oppression? Will you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, it's like one person who's on the moving sidewalk is getting this huge advantage, even though they're not really doing anything to exert that advantage, while others are walking at a normal pace beside them, but the people on the sidewalk are still being propelled forward.
Yeah, and especially, I think when I think about my role as an educator, I kind of have options. I can run on the sidewalk, I can stand on the sidewalk, or I can actively walk against that. And so that's also kind of a question for us to pose, like in our everyday interactions with kids, with families, and our curricular choices, are we making choices that kind of just like stand on that sidewalk, or are we actively kind of questioning that sidewalk itself? And so that is actually the basis of CRP. So CRP is really cool because in a lot of ways, it's actually just this like lens that we see everything through. And it's a critical lens that we put on to say like, are we questioning what the sidewalk is at every single moment in every single plan? And I think very specifically thinking about like systems, and a lot of that questioning has come out in our past sessions together, and that's great because I think that that is really like inherently the base of like what CRP is in its truest form. CRP is not a full curriculum. I think that's a really important key point there because like really like it's based on like who your kids are and their individual narratives, and our kids change each year. And so those individual narratives change each year. And so part of that is actually just getting to know like our kids and like their full true authenticity and their stories and their truth. It's not choosing a text or a learning experience based solely on race or demographics. It's really thinking more about like what are the themes that are coming up in my students' lives, what is actually relevant for my students, and sometimes that may intersect with this, but it's not limited to that. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then it's also not lowering academic rigor in order to increase relevance. And I think that sometimes that's a misconception that we see played out. I don't know necessarily like so much here, but like just when people talk about CRP, sometimes that happens. And so this was really helpful for me. I know this is small, but I'm going to talk through it. So culturally relevant pedagogy, this comes to us from a pretty amazing leader. She actually was a school leader with KIPP for a very long time, and now does a lot of equity work around the country. And basically, there's a lot of models for CRP, and I think that this does a good job of breaking it down into kind of like 3 levers, and saying like there are 3 levers that really inform culturally relevant pedagogy. One is academic excellence, because all students deserve access to the highest levels of academic rigor, and if they're not, then that's a disservice to that community. And so academic excellence we would define as like intellectual growth students experience as a result of classroom instruction and learning experience. It's rigorous academic language and cognitive skills. So thinking about like all of our sheltering priorities, our IP like worthy tasks, things like that. It's collective learning community. So it's like how are students engaging in the learning? It's ratio and all of those types of things. And it's critical lens of standards and pedagogy. So is it the right stuff going in front of kids? Cultural competence is the one we hear about often. People are pretty familiar with this one? Yes? And so I think really this is just like helping students to appreciate and celebrate their cultures of origin while gaining knowledge of and fluency in at least one other culture. So thinking not just about like what does it mean to stand in my own truth, but also like how am I expanding that understanding to also kind of like hold that up against other truths that may exist within the world. And I think that it's using culture as a vehicle for learning. It's maintaining a student's cultural integrity while helping students achieve academically. The last piece, and this is like, I just think this is like such a cool one, is socio-political consciousness. And this is the component of CRP that really talks about, are we helping students to actually just like pause and almost like step back and say like, whoa, like what does this author's position of power say about how they wrote this book, and what does that say about the value that society at this time placed on me as a person if I was to exist at that time. And thinking really critically about what that means for themselves, I think this gets to a lot of like the, I think, motivation to action component. And so an example of this, if we're thinking about like what would this look like in a lesson, academically excellent, this would be a 6th grade science standard, would be students are learning about nutrients within their body and they're building a diet based on that, based on their understanding kind of like how these nutrients work together, what foods are found in. And we could stop there, right? And that would be academically excellent. Where we build in the cultural competence and the socio-political consciousness would be saying like, okay, but like what resources are available to different communities in Denver? Like where are the food deserts? And specifically, not what does that say about like my community's value placed on food, but actually like what does that say about society's value placed on my community? And like how does how resources are allocated show up in what I'm able to eat? And then going back to the academic excellence, like what is the impact of that on my body, right? And I think often within English we hear about like text comparisons. So like one, like do we want our kids to have access to like the canon? For sure, because like that is a language of power and we want students to be able to access that. And are we critically reflecting on like what are the themes within that novel? Like what is the position of power of that author? Or am I contrasting that with like another author who maybe like isn't coming from the same position of power, same ideas, same skills or knowledge, and we're going to get out of the novel, and then can I step back and be meta about like how that influences how those texts are written? Boom. So this is like a start, and I would say this is like a plug for the working group. If this is something that like you want to further explore, or you feel like this is an area of strength and expertise, like please come and share your voice. Because again, like I don't have all the answers in this, and like I think that like this is definitely a group effort, and it's an ongoing process every single year. So with that in mind, a couple CRP core practices that we'll dip into just briefly before we kind of zoom back out. Walsh, can I get you guys to just kind of like read straight down the table? Walsh, will you start with the top?
Core practices informed by CRP represent the planned and in-the-moment instructional decisions that are fundamental for students to practice academic growth, personal growth, access, and social and political consciousness.
The first one, creating and maintaining a productive learning environment. Teaching towards an instructional goal.
Positioning students as competent sense makers.
Teaching with society in mind.
Personalization and adaptation to learning environments.
Yeah, so those are just really quick core practices in terms of CRP. And again, I know this is a really quick overview. Like I said, come to the working group, and then we'll definitely get deeper into it once school leaders are trained on this. As we move forward, I just want us to remind ourselves that even though we are focusing on race, on the intersection of race today, right, our students, ourselves, live within many intersections, right, just like we see in this, and that affects our our pathways in terms of our lives, our outcomes, and how we interact with society. And so let's just keep that in mind as we walk through today and as we only focus on rights today in terms of the next exercises that we're going to be doing.
Okay, so we're gonna get up and move. I know that it's been a long day. Do you want to do agreements?
Yeah, so really quick, we're just going to go through some agreements. We won't go really deep into them. I'll just go ahead, we just can go ahead and read the bolded part since you guys got this in the email. So if I can just go ahead and get popcorn readers for these so you guys don't get tired of hearing my voice. Number 1. Thank you, Wood.
Expect and accept non-closure.
Mikowski.
Accept and lean into December.
Up.
Confidentiality.
Curtis. 4.
Seek to understand?
Van.
Equity of voices.
Trujillo.
Can't read it, don't have my glasses today.
Collective ownership.
Thank you, Mendel.
all done that at once.
Goldsmith.
Stay engaged.
Thank you. And then Wallen.
Speak your truth.
Thank you.
Cool. So these are all big, I'd say like words, concepts, a variation of terms that popped up in the different readings. And think about right now, what resonated or sparked kind of some interest from you that you would want to continue the conversation around. Essentially what we're going to be doing is there are gallery walk posters outside, and there's one for each of these terms. We're going to say that we're going to try to keep it like roughly to no more than 5 to a group in the vein of like respecting our feedback and trying to keep it like small groups so that there's space for discussion. And as you go to your gallery walk poster, what you're going to be doing, and I'll put these back up in a second, but what you're going to be doing is talking based on the readings. 1, define this term based on a shared understanding from the readings. That's not a question, but you get the gist. And then 2, where does this intersect with our role as teachers? So thinking about this and bringing it home to KDC, like what does that mean for you kind of in the space that we stand? You're really choosing here what is, I think, a place that you are going to feel like this is really fruitful conversation for me right now. If that means we have one group that's at 6 or we need to make like 2 of them poster, that's fine. Also, we'll adapt and personalize how we need to. But take like 10 seconds, think for right now which term you want to go to. Up. And then we're going to take about 5 minutes for our initial conversation. The questions are posted in orange on the lockers as well. Are there any questions before we jump outside? Yeah?
What time should we be back for TNTP?
What time should you be back for?
4.
Yeah. Wait, like from this?
Yeah, I was assuming that we'd probably do this and then transition back.
Oh, we're only going to take about 5 minutes this time. We got you guys. Yeah, we're only going to take about 5 minutes for this, for the first part. Cool? Yeah, we'll give you guys time to use. Cool? Okay, so go ahead, jump outside, we'll bring markers and find the poster that will be
That's like a cruel joke. Yeah. But I still wish I had that.
I would say, I don't know if it's actually, it's probably going to be
Well, so it's based on your intention.
and it's not just getting called out, but I think it's a huge part of it.
It's like how some of my wife was like, this is like
As educators, like you can't have
Yeah.
to assume, because I think that was
And in one. So, really quickly, so because we didn't get to dive into each of these terms at the same level of depth, we are going to kind of like see how our teammates process. And as you guys rotate as a group and then talk as a group about one, like what are affirmations, what are things that we agree with and that we would second, what are things that we would question or additional questions we have, and if there's anything that you feel like might be missing, please add it to the poster. People will have time to actually come back to their original poster at the end and kind of see all of the commentary on it. Cool? So we'll move to the right, and we'll do roughly like 30, we'll see how 30 seconds goes, and if we need to adjust, we'll adjust from there. Sound good? Okay, so let's move to the right one, and our time will start once we get there. So affirmations, questions, and additions. Clockwise? Yep, that what you mean? Clockwise. Is that alliterations or
I would say move with the flow. Like I think that actually is a box.
I feel like sorry.
I think it's reading ourselves, our bodies, prejudice. Okay, go ahead and bring it back. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead and create a circle. A long oval, more so.
We can finish this circle, let's do it.
We're all really Okay, really quick, what we want to do is just share out what resonated with you in terms of the word where you sit at, the conversations that you had, and maybe any comments that were added that you didn't think of before. So why don't we go ahead and start with race, and then we'll go around this way.
We're going to do like one person who can kind of take the lead per group.
So race.
Can you repeat the questions again, just so I make sure I answer them concisely?
So just highlight any things that rose to the surface in terms of things, the most important things that you talked about.
Okay, cool. So I'm gonna weirdly look at this poster and talk to you all. I think the thing that stuck out most to me was just like this idea that there's like two things. One, that like race is this like socially constructed idea, and then that the idea that our kids and us and people always don't, or usually don't always just fit into one box. And so like assuming like, oh, I think you are this, therefore I'm gonna think X, Y, and Z can be like really dangerous. Like, so like as educators, like not assuming, but and also knowing our own story so we can connect and also be aware. Cool?
Racism?
I think the big piece here is just racism is a system of advantage. So that article kind of, instead of looking at like a disadvantage side, was looking at like the benefits, and that essentially naming that like white people benefit from a racist society. And it drew a distinction that like when people hear, does this mean all white people are racist? We hear, does this mean all white people are bad people? And I think like that was an interesting part of that article. And so, like, racism isn't prejudice because there is power and there's advantage, and that reverse racism because those things does not exist. The things that stand out.
Next.
Yeah, we had white fragility. So this is kind of hand in hand with these two over here, white privilege and microaggression. But basically when you, as a white person, either like take offense, get defensive, or feel sensitive to some aspect of your privilege, or maybe an implicit bias sort of being acknowledged. And so a couple examples would be like the one reading, there was a stewardess who asked the two black men to move to the back, and then when kind of called out on that, responds really aggressively, like, how dare you, I've never had a racist thought in my life, but like that defensiveness would be based on this fragility. And also I think of all lives matter as like a response to Black Lives Matter, this sort of idea that white dominant culture is being threatened and we need to like elbow our way back into the spotlight. Shows a fragility that you're like not trying to let go of that privilege.
Thank you.
So we had white privilege, and our conversation, first was acknowledging that there's like a dominant culture, but then we started to have questions about what does liberation really look like? Is it possible to actually have liberation if there's always gonna be a dominant culture unless there's like an equal share of the demographics of the society? And if cultures can merge together into where we have like a universal sense of values and morals and things like that. So it kind of left us in a gray area because we're asking a lot more questions and coming really to a conclusion of what does liberation look like, what is the process to achieve liberation, and is it truly possible?
Next.
Guys, just because I'm closest to the most there. All right, so microaggressions are little ways that we reveal our bias, maybe even subconscious biases, but reinforce like stereotypes of an oppressed group of people.
And last one.
So we had liberatory consciousness. I think we talked most about how it's a process that you have to go through as a way to like do these things, like to be aware of the ways that oppression is like systematized, and realize that you're actually holding yourself accountable. And I think like the piece that was kind of interesting to us was the like acting and accountability, and how much this program is about like being anti-racist, like an active process.
Hey, thank you all for engaging and